Everyone laughed at the Texas rancher's junk storage until his dog found something under the floor. The air in the junk shed was thick enough to chew. It tasted of rust, sun-baked dust, and the ghosts of forgotten projects. Outside, the Texas panhandle summer was in full scorch, the kind of heat that bleaches the sky to a hazy pale blue and makes the horizon shimmer like a mirage. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of the windmill over by the stock tank and the buzz of a horsefly dive-bombing my sweat-soaked hat. For most folks around Carson County, this shed was a punchline. Jack Callahan's Museum of Useless Iron, my neighbor Dale Miller had called it just last week at the feed store, earning a few chuckles from the other ranchers. I couldn't much blame them. It was a jumbled mess of my father's and grandfather's legacies. Busted tractor parts, coils of brittle rope, dented milk cans, and 100 other things too sentimental to throw out, but too broken to use. I was in there on a fool's errand, trying to impose some kind of order on a century of chaos. My wife, Sarah, had finally put her foot down. "Jack," she'd said that morning over coffee, "if you don't clear a path in that shed, the fire marshal's going to condemn it as a tetanus factory." She had a point. I heaved a stack of petrified leather harnesses off a sawhorse, the dust pluming up in the slanted afternoon light. That's when I noticed Scout. He was my Australian shepherd, a blue merle with one eye the color of the sky and the other as brown as the earth. He wasn't just a dog. He was my shadow, my partner. He could read a nervous heifer from 100 yards and knew my moods better than I did. Usually in the shed, he'd be nosing around for field mice or napping in the sliver of shade by the door. But not today. He was standing dead still in the center of the shed, his body rigid, his head cocked. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I hadn't heard since he'd cornered a rattlesnake down by the creek last spring. His focus was lasered in on a section of the grimy wooden floor. "What is it, boy?" I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. "Smell a rat?" He ignored me. His claws clicked on the old pine as he took a tentative step forward, then another. He lowered his snout to a crack between two floorboards and sniffed, a deep, pulsating inhale. Then he started pawing at the wood, not playfully, but with a frantic, determined scratching. Splinters flew. The growl deepened, vibrating through the soles of my worn-out boots. I'd been ranching this land my whole life, all 45 years of it. I'd learned long ago that when a good dog gets fixated on something, you pay attention. A man's eyes can fool him, but a dog's nose, especially one as sharp as Scout's, tells the plain, unvarnished truth. I walked over and knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. His muscles were coiled tight as a spring. "Easy now. What's got you so worked up?" He whined, a high, anxious sound, and looked up at me, his mismatched eyes pleading. Then he went right back to scratching, his claws digging grooves into the weathered timber. I looked closer at the floorboard he was so obsessed with. It looked like all the others, grayed by time, stained with oil, half buried in dust and dirt. But as he kept scratching, I saw it. One of the nails holding it down was rusted clean through. The board had a slight give to it when I pressed on the edge. Curiosity, that old troublemaker, got the better of me. The neighbors could laugh all they wanted, but something was under my floor, and my dog was dead set on me finding out what. All right, you win," I grumbled, giving his ears a good scratch. I went over to the workbench and rummaged through a coffee can full of old tools until my fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of a crowbar. The board groaned in protest as I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the crack and put my weight into it. The old wood was stubborn, clinging to its place after decades of slumber. With a final, sharp crack, the nails surrendered. I lifted the board, and then a second one beside it, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity in the dirt floor beneath. The air that rose from it was different, cool and musty, smelling of deep earth and something else, something metallic and old. Scout shoved his nose into the opening, whining with excitement. I peered into the darkness. There, nestled in the packed dirt, was a shape wrapped in what looked like dark, oil-cured leather. It was a box, about the size of a small toolbox, bound with rusted iron straps. My heart gave a solid thump against my ribs. This was no forgotten can of nails. This was something someone had taken great pains to hide. With Scout dancing impatiently beside me, I reached into the hole. My fingers brushed against the rough, cracked leather. The box was heavier than it looked. I gripped the iron straps and lifted it out, setting it gently on the floor. It sat there in a cloud of disturbed dust, looking ancient and alien in the familiar clutter of the shed. Scout circled it once, sniffed it thoroughly, and then sat back on his haunches, looking up at me as if to say, "Well, what are you waiting for?" I ran a hand over my jaw, the rasp of my stubble loud in the sudden silence. The windmill had stopped creaking. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. This shed wasn't just a collection of junk anymore. It was a place with a secret. And whatever that secret was, it had been waiting right here, under my feet, for a long, long time. I carried the box to the house like a man carrying a sleeping child, Scout trotting at my heels, his tail held high. The weight of it was more than just physical. It felt heavy with history, with the untold stories of the men who had walked this land before me. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. The screen door slammed shut behind me, a familiar sound that suddenly felt like the closing of a chapter and the opening of something entirely new and unknown. Inside, the cool air of the house was a welcome relief. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio as she peeled potatoes for dinner. She looked up when I came in, her smile fading into a look of concern when she saw the expression on my face and the strange object in my arms. "Jack? What on earth is that? Don't tell me you brought another piece of rusty junk into my kitchen." "I don't think it's junk, Sarah," I said, my voice sounding rougher than usual. I set the box on the sturdy oak table that had been in my family for 4 generations. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. Scout laid down under the table, his chin on his paws, but his eyes never left the box. I took a deep breath and began to work on the rusted latch. It wouldn't budge. I ended up getting a flathead screwdriver from the drawer and prying it open. The hinges shrieked like a banshee as the lid creaked upward, releasing a puff of air that smelled of old paper and gun oil. We both leaned over to look. The interior was lined with faded velvet, now the color of dried blood. On top lay a pistol, a Civil War-era Colt Dragoon by the looks of it. Its metal was pitted with rust, but the intricate scrollwork on the cylinder was still visible, a testament to a craftsman from another time. Beneath the pistol was a bundle of papers, tied with a leather thong that crumbled to dust the moment I touched it. They were yellowed and brittle, covered in the elegant looping cursive of the 19th century. Tucked in with them was a small, hand-drawn map on a piece of what felt like tanned hide. "My God, Jack," Sarah whispered, her hand on my arm. "Where did you find this?" "Under the floor in the junk shed." Scout found it. He wouldn't leave it alone. I carefully lifted the papers out. The top document was a land deed, dated 1875. The name on it was Jack Callahan, my great-great-grandfather. I knew the name, of course, from the family Bible, but he was a ghost, a myth. He was the one who came to Texas after the war, the one who first broke this sod. But the boundaries described on the deed didn't make sense. They seemed to encompass our current property, but also a significant chunk of the Miller Ranch next door. A full 500 acres, stretching all the way to Prairie Dog Town Fork Red River. Beneath the deed were a half-dozen letters, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. I picked one up, its edges threatening to disintegrate. The handwriting was tight, urgent. "The claim is righteous," it read, "but the times are not. Miller is a snake, and his union sympathies give him sway with the courts in Austin. I will not see my family cheated of what is theirs by blood and sweat. I have secured the proof and the means to defend it. Should the worst come to pass, it is hidden where only a Callahan would think to look, beneath the tools that build our future. The shadow of the lone cottonwood at dusk points the way. Trust the land. It remembers. A chill snaked its way down my spine despite the 100-degree heat outside. The Miller family, our neighbors. Our rivalry with them was as old as the fences that separated our properties. It was mostly dormant now, reduced to competitive bidding on bulls at the auction and quiet glares at Sunday service. But my dad used to talk about how his grandfather and old man Miller's grandfather nearly came to blows over water rights in the big drought of '34. This was something else entirely. This was the root of it all. "What does it mean, Jack?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "The means to defend it." My eyes went to the map. It was crudely drawn, but geographically accurate. I could make out the familiar contours of our land, the bend in the creek, the rise of the small mesa we called Flat Top, the location of the old homestead, which was now just a pile of foundation stones and memories. And there, near the junk shed's location, was an X marked in faded ink. Beside it, a single phrase: the federal wages of sin. The stories came rushing back then, the half-forgotten local legends you hear over beers at the VFW Hall. Tales of a notorious outlaw, a Confederate sympathizer named Silas Kane, who was said to have raided a Union Army payroll wagon somewhere in the panhandle just after the war ended. The gold, they said, was never found. It had vanished into the vast, empty plains, becoming little more than a ghost story. I spent the next several days in a haze. I'd go about my chores, checking fences, moving the herd to fresh pasture, hauling hay. But my mind was back in that shed, with that box. The land I rode over every day no longer felt simple. It felt layered, pregnant with secrets. Every ancient cottonwood, every strange rock formation seemed to hold a clue. I found myself staring at the boundary fence separating our land from the Millers, an invisible line that had now become a very real and tangible question mark. Scout stuck close, as if he knew the weight of what we'd found. When I'd pull out the papers at night, spreading them across the kitchen table under the warm glow of the lamp, he'd lie at my feet, his head up, watching me. One evening, as I was studying the map, trying to make sense of the phrase about the shadow of the lone cottonwood, Scout got up, nudged my hand with his nose, and let out a soft whine. He walked to the back door and looked back at me, his tail giving a single, expectant wag. "What is it, boy?" I asked. He whined again and scratched at the door. It was almost dusk, the time of day when the world turns gold and the shadows grow long and mysterious. On a hunch, I grabbed the map and my hat and followed him. He led me not toward the shed, but out past the corrals, toward the west pasture. There, standing on a small rise, was a massive gnarled cottonwood, the oldest tree on the property. I'd passed it 1,000 times, used its shade for a quick break on hot days. It was just a tree. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the tree's shadow stretched out long and thin across the prairie grass, a dark finger pointing directly back toward the homestead. Specifically, it pointed toward the junk shed. The shadow of the lone cottonwood at dusk points the way. My great-great-grandfather's words echoed in my head. It wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was a literal instruction. My investigation became an obsession. I unearthed my grandfather's diaries from a trunk in the attic. He was a man of few words, his entries mostly detailing rainfall, cattle prices, and births and deaths. But tucked into the year 1952, I found something. "Dale Miller's father came by today, talked about the old fence line again, said his deed is clear. Mine feels clearer, but Dad told me to never speak of Cormac's box. A sleeping dog best left to lie. A burden of honor is heavier than a burden of dirt." A burden of honor. He knew. My grandfather knew about the box and the claim, and he chose to keep it secret, to let that sleeping dog lie. Why? Was he afraid? Or was he just trying to keep the peace? I knew I couldn't solve this with old papers alone. I needed someone who remembered the stories, not just the facts. That led me to Earl's Cafe in town, a place where the coffee is strong and the gossip is stronger. Earl himself was pushing 90, his skin a roadmap of a life lived under the Texas sun. He sat in the same corner booth every morning, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the paper. I sat down across from him, the bell over the door jingling my arrival. "Morning, Earl." He lowered his paper, his pale blue eyes studying me over his spectacles. "Jack, you got a look on your face like a man who's seen a ghost." "Something like that," I admitted. I told him what I'd found. I didn't mention the map or the gold, just the old deed and the letters about a dispute with the Millers. Earl listened, nodding slowly. He took a long sip of his coffee. "Not surprised," he said finally, his voice a gravelly rumble. "That feud goes way back. My own grandfather used to say that the Callahans got the better land, but the Millers got the better lawyers. Happened a lot back then. Reconstruction was a messy business. A man's allegiance during the war could mean more than a government seal on a piece of paper." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "They say your great-great-grandpappy rode with the Confederacy, and that he had dealings with Silas Kane after. Dangerous company to keep." So the outlaw legend was tied to my family. The pieces were starting to slot together, forming a picture I wasn't sure I was ready to see. The pistol, the claim, the cryptic mention of federal wages of sin. Cormac Callahan hadn't just been a rancher. He'd been a man trying to survive in a lawless time, using whatever means necessary to protect what was his. The next day, things got complicated. I was out near the shed, re-examining the area, when a dusty Ford F-250 pulled up. Dale Miller got out. He was my age, with a hard face and eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. "Callahan," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "Heard you've been spending a lot of time in this old relic heap. Found anything interesting?" Word travels fast in a small town. Someone at the cafe must have talked. "Just cleaning it out, Dale. Something my wife's been on me about for years," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That so?" He smirked, kicking at a piece of scrap metal. "Funny. I heard you were digging. My granddad always said you Callahans had a habit of digging where you shouldn't. Said some things are better left buried." The phrase was too similar to the one in my own grandfather's diary for it to be a coincidence. The Millers knew something too. They had their own version of the story, their own secrets to protect. The old feud wasn't dormant at all. It had just been waiting for a spark. And I was holding the match. The confrontation with Dale lit a fire under me. He was poking around, which meant time was running out. That evening, as a massive thunderhead began to build on the western horizon, turning the sky a bruised, angry purple, I went back to the shed. The air was electric, charged with ozone and tension. The wind whipped through the open doors, rattling loose sheets of tin and sending dust devils dancing through the clutter. I stood over the hole in the floor, the empty space where the box had been. It felt incomplete. The letters, the map, the pistol, they were the what. But I still didn't fully understand the why. Why go to such extremes? Why hide a land deed with a gun and a cryptic map? There had to be more. Scout, who had followed me in, seemed to agree. He bypassed the hole and went to the back wall of the shed. He started sniffing intently at the dirt floor right up against the foundation, the same way he'd sniffed at the floorboard. He began to dig, not just scratching this time, but tearing at the earth with a fierce urgency, sending clumps of dirt flying. The wind howled outside, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter on the tin roof. "What is it now, boy?" I yelled over the rising storm. He didn't stop. He was digging like his life depended on it. A strange feeling, a mix of dread and exhilaration, washed over me. The map. The federal wages of sin. The X was marked near the shed, but it wasn't in the center where the box was. It was closer to the back wall. My great-great-grandfather's instructions were layered, a puzzle within a puzzle. The box was just the first key. I grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall, its wooden handle worn smooth by my father's hands. The ground was packed hard as concrete. I drove the shovel into the earth where Scout was digging. It clanged against something solid just a few inches down. Stone. I dug around the edges, the storm now raging outside. Rain hammered on the roof in a deafening roar, and flashes of lightning illuminated the shed in stark, ghostly strobes. Slowly, I uncovered the edges of a large, flat stone slab, about 3 feet square. It was fitted so perfectly into the earth that it was nearly invisible. It took all my strength, using the shovel as a lever, but I finally managed to pry one end of it up. A wave of cool, damp air washed over me, a smell of earth that had been undisturbed for 100 years. I shone my flashlight into the opening. It was a small, stone-lined cellar, a hidey hole no bigger than a coffin. And inside, stacked neatly, were 3 canvas sacks, dark with age and mildew. My hands were shaking as I reached in and pulled one out. It was incredibly heavy. The canvas was so rotten it tore apart in my hands, and then I saw it, the dull, unmistakable gleam of gold. Coins, dozens of them, spilled onto the dirt floor of the shed, catching the beam of my flashlight. They were U.S. double eagles, their dates ranging from the 1850s to 1864. The Union payroll. It was real. I sank back on my heels, the gold coins scattered in the dirt at my feet. The thunder cracked directly overhead, and Scout pressed against my side, letting out a low whine. It all made sense now. The disputed land was rich, perfect for grazing, with access to the river. Cormac knew the Millers would fight him for it, using their political connections. He couldn't win in a courtroom, so he armed himself with something more powerful than a deed. He secured a fortune, Silas Kane's stolen gold, as a war chest, a way to give his family the power to fight for their land, even a century later. The burden of honor my grandfather wrote about wasn't just protecting a secret. It was the terrible responsibility of wielding that kind of power. That night, I barely slept. The gold was reburied, the slab back in its place, but the knowledge of it sat like a stone in my gut. This was bigger than a few acres of pasture. This was about justice, honor, and a legacy I now had to carry. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. This had to be handled the right way, the old way, man to man. But first, I needed irrefutable proof, something beyond the papers in the box. I drove into Amarillo to the Carson County Records office. The air inside smelled of dust and decaying paper. I spent hours poring over brittle, oversized books of survey maps and property transfers, the kind of records nobody looks at anymore. With the help of a clerk who seemed intrigued by my strange quest, I found it, the original 1874 government survey of the county. And there it was, in faded but official ink, the Callahan property line, exactly as it was drawn on Cormac's deed, including the 500 acres the Millers now claimed. A subsequent filing in 1882, signed by a judge with known ties to the Miller family, showed a corrected boundary line, but the original survey was the legal bedrock. I had them. I called Dale Miller that afternoon. "Meet me at the west fence line," I said. "The one by the old cottonwood. There's something you need to see." He was there in 20 minutes, his truck idling, a cloud of dust settling around it. He got out, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of smug defiance on his face. "Come to finally admit you're crazy, Callahan?" I didn't answer. I just walked toward the fence, a length of rusted barbed wire strung between weathered cedar posts. Scout was at my side, a silent, watchful presence. The air was washed clean by the storm, and the sky was a deep, endless blue. "This fence is in the wrong place, Dale," I said, my voice calm and steady. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Is that what this is about? That old story? My family's had cattle on this side of that wire since before my grandpa was born." "That may be," I said, "but it was never your family's land to begin with." I laid it all out for him. I took Cormac's deed from my jacket pocket, its paper so fragile it felt like it might turn to dust in the breeze. I showed him the copy of the original county survey map I'd made. I told him the story the letters revealed, of a land dispute born from the ashes of the Civil War. I told him about the box, the pistol, the warning to my descendants. He listened, his smirk slowly fading, replaced by a guarded scowl. You can't be serious. You think some dusty old papers you found in your trash pile are going to change 100 years of history? A judge signed off on that boundary. A crooked judge paid off by your ancestors, I said, my voice hardening. My great-great-grandfather knew he couldn't win a fight in the courts, so he prepared for a different kind of fight. He left proof, and he left the means to see it through. This was the moment of truth. I hadn't planned on telling him about the gold. It was my family's secret, our burden. But looking at his stubborn, disbelieving face, I knew it was the only thing that would make him understand the gravity of it all. He buried a fortune, Dale, a fortune in gold, stolen from a union payroll, not to make himself rich, but to give his family the ammunition to one day reclaim what was stolen from them. He was willing to become a criminal in the eyes of the law to secure his family's rightful legacy. That's how much this land meant to him, and it's how much it means to me. The color drained from his face. The local legend of Silas Kane's gold wasn't just a story anymore. It was a real and present force in the field standing between us. The sheer, insane truth of it hung in the air. He shook his head, looking around as if searching for an escape. I don't believe you. You're making this up. And that's when Scout, my loyal, brilliant Scout, did his part. He had been sitting patiently by my leg, but at the peak of the tension, he stood up, walked a few paces along the fence line, and began nudging at something with his nose. It was a reddish-brown rock, half buried in the prairie grass and dirt, no different from 1,000 others. He nudged it again, then looked back at me, a low woof rumbling in his chest. I walked over. The rock was a piece of sandstone, and carved into its weathered surface was a simple cross, and the letters USGS. A United States Geological Survey marker, the original survey marker from 1874, exactly where Cormac's map and the official county plat said it should be. It was 50 yards on our side of the fence, marking the true corner of my family's property. The land itself was bearing witness. I knelt and brushed the dirt away from the carving. The land remembers, Dale, I said softly, quoting the letter. It always remembers. Dale stared at the marker, then at my face, then back at the marker. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a dawning, shocked understanding. A century of lies, passed down through his family, had just crumbled to dust at his feet. He looked out over the rolling pasture, the land his family had worked and profited from, and for the first time, he saw it for what it was, ours. He didn't say a word. He just turned, walked back to his truck, and drove away, leaving a plume of dust that settled slowly back onto the land that was, finally, and indisputably, Callahan soil again. The lawyers got involved after that, but it was just a formality. With the original survey map, the deed, and the physical marker, the Miller family had no choice but to concede. The old fence came down. A new one went up, 500 acres deeper into the horizon, restoring the Callahan ranch to its original boundaries. It was a quiet victory, settled not with a lawsuit, but with a reluctant yet official signing of papers in a stuffy office in Amarillo. Dale and I shook hands. It wasn't a warm handshake, but it was a firm one. An end to the bad blood. The gold was another matter. I could have kept it all. A secret windfall that would make my family wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. But it didn't feel right. That gold was a weight, a burden of honor, just as my grandfather had written. It was tainted by its history, but it could be redeemed. After long talks with Sarah, we decided what to do. We kept a portion, enough to pay off the ranch's debts, set up college funds for our kids, and ensure that a bad drought would never again threaten to break us. The rest, the vast majority of it, we donated anonymously to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, along with the Colt Dragoon and a carefully worded letter about the preservation of local history. The federal wages of sin would now serve the public, helping to tell the story of this hard, beautiful land. The neighbors who once laughed at my junk storage fell silent. The shed became a place of local legend. Some folks started calling it Callahan's Bank. I just saw it as the place where my dog reminded me that the past is never truly gone. It's just buried, waiting for a loyal nose and a curious heart to uncover it. Life on the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythms, but everything felt different, deeper. When I rode the new fence line, I felt a connection to this place that went beyond ownership. It was a bond forged in my great-great-grandfather's sweat and determination, a legacy preserved by my grandfather's quiet integrity, and a truth revealed by my partner's unerring instinct. One evening, I was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun set fire to the clouds. The sky was a masterpiece of orange, pink, and purple. The windmill spun slowly, its familiar creak a comforting song. Scout came and laid his head on my knee, his mismatched eyes looking up at me with that bottomless well of canine devotion. I scratched him behind the ears, right in his favorite spot. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. All that history, all that trouble, buried right under our feet, and you knew. He just thumped his tail against the wooden steps, a simple, perfect answer. He didn't know about land deeds or Civil War gold. He just knew something was out of place. He trusted his senses, and more importantly, he trusted me to listen. I looked out over the vast expanse of my home, my heritage. The 500 acres of reclaimed pasture rolled toward the river, dark and peaceful in the fading light. It wasn't just more land. It was a restored name, a healed wound, a story brought full circle. And it was all thanks to the stubborn, brilliant, four-legged historian who had refused to let a sleeping dog lie. In the quiet of that Texas twilight, I understood that the greatest treasure we'd found wasn't the gold. It was the truth. And the loyalty that led us to it.